So let's look at Islam. Let's go back to the start of Islam, the 7th century. And would you have considered, if you were a neighbor of the Arabs, would you consider them peaceful? No. If you were living in the Byzantine Empire, would you have considered the early Arabs peaceful? Definitely not. What about if you were a Persian living in the Persian Empire? No, because both are attacked by the Arabs, the Muslims. The Byzantines are driven up into the Anatolian plateau, and most of the rest of the Middle East is taken, and later on the North African coast. And the Persian Empire is destroyed. It collapses when it's attacked by the Arabs. And the Persians are treated much worse than the Christians and Jews, people of the book, who are at least monotheists and had been dealt with by Muhammad, and there were strictures on what you could and couldn't do with them based on the Quran. When they get to Persia, they're dealing with polytheists, Zoroastrians, and who by that point had started out as monotheists but become sort of polytheists. And they weren't covered by anything in the Quran, so you could pretty much do whatever you want to them, and they did. And the treatment of the Persians was much worse than the treatment of the Christians and the Jews in the Byzantine lands. So certainly in the 700s, nobody would have thought of Muslims and the word peace. In the 8th century, it's the same thing. They're still spreading out. In the 8th century, they're moving up into the Iberian Peninsula, raiding up as far as central France. The fighting in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, will go on for between 700 and 800 years. Now, that's not to say everything that happened was the fault of the Muslims. The Christians aren't peaceful either. But, both sides commit atrocities. They both wage war. They both kill each other. And this goes on for centuries. Sicily is taken in the 800s, where my family's from. I mean, if you were a Sicilian in this period and the Muslims are coming in, you would not have considered them peaceful. You wouldn't consider the Normans who came in and drove them out peaceful either, but that's beside the point. In the early 11th century, the Turks, who were by this point running the show pretty much, at least the military parts of the show in the Islamic world, defeat the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert and overrun the Anatolian plateau. Now, if you were a Byzantine in this period, you would not have considered Muslims peaceful, because they're coming in and they're sacking the towns and the villages and burning the church and killing the priests and raping the nuns and doing all the other nasty stuff that prompts the crusade. It's a counterattack against this. Now then you get a period where the Muslims are on the defensive. They're losing ground in the Iberian Peninsula. They lose Sicily to the Normans. The Crusades strike, and the Crusaders are not peaceful. The Christians who come in during the Crusades, as I said in the last 2 lectures ago, are not peaceful people. They're butchers. And the Muslims are fighting back. And then on the heels of that in come the Mongols, and behind them the Timurids following that. So for a couple centuries, the Muslims are on the defensive, but they're hardly peaceful. They're fighting back, they're struggling, and they're also expanding under the guise of the Ottoman Turks, who are moving, take Constantinople in 1453, and move into the Balkans. The final siege of Vienna is 1683, almost 200 years after Columbus sailed from the world. The Turks are still hammering away into Central Europe and threatening to take it. You have to remember the Russians, who deal with the Mongol yoke, which lasts almost into the 1600s. The Mongols who eventually adopt Islam. So when the Russians are dealing with the Mongols all through the 1500s and the 1400s, 1300s, they're dealing with Muslims, and they're paying tribute. Their towns are under tribute. Their people are being enslaved. They're being carted off by the Tatars, and you would hardly associate any of this with being peaceful. And you have to understand that when you look at Russian history and the traditions there and the hatreds. If you were living in the Balkans, where the Muslims control, you would hardly consider them peaceful, because they're taking your kids as slaves, and the slave trade that they took. If you're living in the Slavic lands of Ukraine or the steppe of Russia or Central Asia or the Caucasus Mountains, you're being subjected to raiding and slaving and by the Muslims. You would not consider them peaceful. The African slave trade, which started in the 700s and only ends in the 1800s because of the British Navy. The British stop it. It's not stopped internally where Muslims have a change of heart and think slavery is wrong. I mean, the West took 12 million African slaves. Probably the Muslims took as many, if not more, because the slave trade went on for centuries longer. And that's just the East African slave trade. In some ways, they were responsible for some of the slaves that were sold to us in the West African slave trade. And then you have the slave trade into, well, you have the slaves being taken by the Barbary Corsairs who raid as far afield as Iceland and Ireland. They take American slaves in the 18th century. And then you have the slave trades, and the slaves being taken in the Slavic lands, which may have, and the Caucasus, which may have totaled as many as 10 to 20 million more there. So none of these people would have thought that Muslims were peaceful. In India, I mean, the 500-year conquest of the Indian subcontinent by the Mongols, by the Muslims, the estimates are as many as 80 million people died. That's a lot, even if it's exaggerated. It's only 40 million or only 20 million. You know, Hitler killed 24 million people when he invaded Russia. That's a lot of people. So if you were living in India in this period, I mean, Indians were not like Christians and Jews. They were polytheists, so you could do pretty much whatever you wanted to them, and they did. And they're horror stories. There's nothing. You want to read horror stories about the Islamic conquest, read the ones from India. They're far worse than anything we had to put up with in the West. Now, the spread of Islam into what's today Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, was done primarily by missionaries and was peaceful. The spread of Islam into China was peaceful. It wasn't peaceful when the Chinese tried to get rid of it because they wiped everybody out. So there are elements of Islam that are peaceful. But what I'm saying is, if you look at the history of this period, you know, when was Islam peaceful? The 1700s, they were constantly at war. Now, you could argue that the wars weren't their fault. They were started by the Russians or the Austrians, but they were still constantly at war. Islam was hardly considered peaceful. And when the rebellions broke out in the Balkans, for example, among the Greeks, they were suppressed horribly. Not that the Greeks themselves didn't commit atrocities against Muslims, but the Muslims, the Turks, committed horrible atrocities against the Greeks. And that was going on right up into the 20th century. So when I hear this thing, but you know, Islam is inherently peaceful religion, I begin to wonder, you know, what history book did people read? When was it peaceful? Islam has been at war with its neighbors almost from the very beginning, and you can argue that it wasn't always their fault. I mean, that's a perfectly valid argument to make, that they didn't ask for these problems, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're peaceful. Far from it. I mean, the Ottoman state, which lasted until, you know, the 1920s, the early 1920s, was a Ghazi state. It was a war machine. That's pretty much the only thing they did that they were any good at. There were a few things in architecture and everything else, but I mean, they never were, what they were primarily good at was conquest. They were the best at that. They called themselves Ghazis, religious warriors, raiders, and that's what they did. They raided and they conquered. Now, I mean, that's the reality. That's the history. So don't tell me what it says in the Quran. Don't tell me what it says in the Hadith. You know, to me as a historian, when I want to know what's all about Islam, I look at the history. And it's a history of, much like Christian history, violence and warfare. You know, I'm not saying that Christianity is inherently has been peaceful in terms of history, but certainly Islam wasn't either. And I think it's also illustrative to look back at what I said about Christianity, because when was Christianity peaceful? Christianity was peaceful when it was separated from state power. In the early centuries, the first 3 to 4 centuries, when they weren't tied up with the Roman Empire. And the last couple centuries, when we've had secularism in the West, where religious leaders don't have the kind of authority and power from the state to use and abuse. But if you look at Islam, it's always tied up with the state, because Muhammad wasn't just a religious leader, unlike Christ. He was also a military and political leader. So it's inherent in Islam that you have a connection, not just to violence, but you have a connection between religion and the state. And what I would argue was, no matter what the religion is, if it's tied into the state, then you're going to have abuses committed against people who don't have the same beliefs. Because that's what's happened in the West. You know, King Henry VIII was a Christian. He was, when he broke off the Church of England from the Church of Rome, he controlled the Anglican Church. But he didn't just persecute Catholics, Roman Catholics. He persecuted Lutherans. He persecuted Calvinists because they didn't believe what his church believed. They had a different set of beliefs. And they were tied to state power because the head of the Church of England was Henry. So he used the power of the state for religious purposes. And the religious leaders used the power of the state for their own purposes. And that's when you have abuses. That's when you have not peace. And what I'm saying is that is inherent, I would argue, with Islam. Doesn't mean it can't be changed. I'm just saying it's harder to change, I think, in Islam than it was for the Christians. And it took the Christian world centuries to change it. And once Christianity got tied up with the state in the 4th century, it took almost 14 to 1500 years to unseparate it again, to get where we are today. Not something that happened overnight. It's not something that happened with one event, one revolution, one person changing everybody's mind. It's a long process that is an entire other set of lectures to explain. So Islam, I would argue, is not only not peaceful in terms of its historical record, but it's not likely to become peaceful anytime soon. Again, I'm not saying it can't become peaceful. I'm just saying it's not likely to become peaceful, at least not, in the immediate future. Maybe in a couple centuries, maybe that will happen, or maybe it will happen more quickly in Islam because they don't have a lot of choice but to change. But for me, when I turn on the TV and I see somebody say that Islam is inherently a religion of peace, and it's just been hijacked or distorted by these ISIS guys or Al-Qaeda guys, I'm sorry. I shake my head. That's not my reading of history, and you're welcome to your own, but it's not mine, and I'm not changing my mind anytime soon.